Okay, and also, if I can please ask that everyone except the poet mute yourselves, please, so we don't have any background noise. Okay, Nkateko, over to you. And thank you so much for being our guest poet tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to share my screen so that you can read along with me. Just find the document. Okay. Does everyone see the document? So I'm gonna start with some self-portrait poems. So I consider myself a confessional poet. And so I found the self-portrait form to be quite an interesting one. So this first poem is Self-Portrait in Utopia. I'm gonna read and then I'll talk about the poem afterwards. Self-Portrait in Utopia. Not quite Aphrodite or Leverhexy, neither porcelain deity nor forgetful witch. Not Adam's rib, small, clean, white, as seen in the dissection hall as out-of-body specimen. Instead, a myth, a revolt, a riot on legs, a hymn hummed slowly, a woman howling at all 14 moons on Neptune, a woman swallowing the earth in June, ending the year midway, a woman birthing the planet anew, a woman last seen at the pool of Bethesda, tempting the water to drink her. A woman neither coven nor convert can convert, a woman neither judge nor jury can convict, neither sinful nor holy, a law holy unto herself. So I wrote that poem. Thank you. I wrote that poem while I was studying the work of Bessie Head, and I found that the protagonist in her work was striving for a kind of freedom that they didn't attain well in their lifetimes or within the stories themselves, and also learning that she wrote about her work was semi-autobiographic, so she was striving for that freedom herself. So I wrote that poem inspired by her plight for that kind of freedom, to be a law unto herself. And so the next one is Self-Portrait as Inpatient. At the height of my illness, I was held, detained, with tenderness, with love, likened to a felt. In my mania, I was the high felt, with tall plateaus and rolling hills, rolling plains, too much hill to fit into this world. In my depression, I was the low felt, a failed rift valley of moodiness and crying spells. In the in-between, the mixed episodes, the highs and lows of being part girl child, part growing woman, with burnt hands from every botched attempt at making a meal. I was the Thornfelt, a semi-arid savanna, believing I was everything and nothing all at once. In the numbness, the unbearable cold, when I reached for sharp objects and leaned towards steep inclines to feel something, anything, it was erosion that I was compared to, a sandy beach with all its castles washed away. In all these states, I was held, restrained. At 19, I stumbled on things that weren't there, was laughed at for falling. I shivered when it wasn't cold and wanted to destroy everything. Of all the things that I tried to ruin with my hands, what remained were the bodies of others, holding, breaking, entering, tearing into me. So self-portrait as inpatient is just that. It's basically a portrait of my own struggle with my mental health and being hospitalized well, specifically I talk about the experience at 19, but there was also an early admission. And I think there's something about the vulnerability or the fragility of being a patient in the public healthcare system specifically that stays with you. And I think having been on both sides of the system, I wrote this poem when I was on the other side and realized just how fragile and how vulnerable I was at that point in my life. The next one is posthumous self-portrait with estranged lover. So this one I wrote during my Sylvia Plath obsession. I started reading Sylvia Plath's work at a time when I was working on a project called Wither with Her. So Wither with Her was a project about mental health, particularly my own mental health. And I think I could relate to Sylvia Plath's writing. I started to read beyond her poetry, but started to read also about her life and particularly her marriage to Ted Hughes. And at the time, I was in a relationship where I saw sort of some similarities between myself and Sylvia Plath and how the trajectory of those relationships were going. And so I wrote this. I'll be Plath and you'll be Hughes, so let my love not rot from disuse. I want no one else, least of all myself, but you I can take, complicit in the self-abuse my therapist labeled the post-separation blues. I fancied you'd return the way you said, but you fell in love with another instead. We were not always breaking, were we? Not always two cracked teacups in a sink, two bodies slow dancing to a fire drill. Don't mind the smoke, savor the thrill. We were not always breaking, no, not two cracked teacups in a sink, but corpses tethering on the brink. Dismantle me, this body in disuse, for you to remake, freshly scarred by unreciprocated desire, charred by you and for you, broken bone, cracked cadaver, rib of your cage. So I wrote this poem when I was studying different forms of poetry, and I really liked the cento as a form. So the cento is a form where you take a line from another person. It's basically a poem that's comprised completely of lines from other people's poetry. And so in this poem, because it was after Sylvia Plath, I took a line from her poem. So it's, I fancied you'd return the way you said. So in her poem, Mad Girl's Love Song, she writes, I fancied you'd return the way you said, but I grow old and forget your name. And so I really liked the first line of that particular stanza, and so I used it in my poem. I have another poem that also has a line from Sylvia Plath's work. I will share that a bit later. So this is self-portrait as grieving ghost. My body is embalmed for burial as my husband weeps, sings hymns and begs that I return to him. Is there allowance for this, to be useful to my mourning lover, in our kitchen as asparagus, in his lab as apparatus, in the ether as apparition, as apologetic ghost, I'm sorry, my beloved, I truly meant to stay. Nobody knows the aftermath, Kalwa said. The malice of death, its wrath unrelenting and sparing none. Nobody can predict the end. Nobody knows that tears fall in the afterlife except us, the dead, the lost, the after what? There's nothing beyond our life together, a chorus we had just begun. My love, even in death, I grieve. So Self-Portrait as Grieving Ghost was me imagining the end of this particular relationship and seeing it as a type of death. I think all losses are types of deaths. I think with a relationship in particular, it's painful because it feels like a death, but the person is still around. And so I thought about, if I had been the one to die, if the relationship had died with me, then how could I still be useful to this person? How could they still find usefulness in me? And so I thought, well, I'll be asparagus in the kitchen. I'll be some sort of thing that is still useful to you, because you may have discarded me, but I still wanted to be useful to you in some way. And so that's why I wrote that one. I'm going to, what did I do? I don't know what I've done now. So I want to share, okay. There we go. So, okay, we've finished the self-portrait poems, and now we're moving on to the craft poems. So at the time when I was so obsessed with craft and different forms of poems, I did talk about the cento earlier, and I wrote a cento. It's called Departure, and I will also share where the lines from that poem come from. Long ago and far away, the thornbird sang for just one day. Lords lost him his mockingbird, his fancy warbler. Satan sweet-talked her. I should have loved a thunderbird instead. At least when spring comes, they roar back again. I'm praying that a hummingbird hands me its ability to hover and fly backwards, winging wildly across the wild orchards and dark green fields, on, and out of sight. So this is a bit different to the normal cento where you just take a line. I took entire stanzas from different poets' works. So stanza 1 was from Legend of the Thornbird by June Kyrie. Stanza 2 was from Morning Poem for the Queen of Sunday by Robert Hayden. Stanza 3 was from Sylvia Plath's Mad Girl's Love Song, a favorite. Stanza 4 is from Observations by Sadiq Sokogi, one of my favorite poets from Nigeria. And stanza 5 is from Everyone Sang by Siegfried Sassoon. So Everyone Sang by Siegfried Sassoon was actually one of the first poems I ever read out loud in high school, so it's still a favorite of mine. And so when I was learning how to write centos, I took pieces from each of these poems, and I took poems that talk about birds, and then came up with something, and I quite like it. So the next craft poem is a pantoum. This is called Pantoum for the Parting. I really enjoyed how the pantoum has so many opportunities to play. And so I imagined, now it's still with this, in this framework with this lover where I have now died. And I thought, what if I died and now I have left a child behind? And that's where this came from. That is the parting that is referred to. What a mess I will leave you with, none the wiser, mass of fragility, baby girl, my face in miniature. turn the ache into architecture. None the wiser, mass of fragility, grow smart like mama, eloquent. Turn the ache into architecture, speeches at presidential suites. Grow smart like mama, eloquent. Your father's height, dizzy spins, speeches at presidential suites, hopelessly enchant the masses. Your father's height, dizzy spins, baby girl, my face in miniature, hopelessly enchant the masses. What a mess I will leave you with. The next craft poem is a ghazal, and this is Ghazal for the Ghastly Going, and this is about a breakup that ended, the breakup actually took a while. It was a negotiation, if anything, and it was all ending in June. And that's why the refrain that I use in this ghazal is June. So yeah, I think when you're writing a ghazal, one of the first things you identify is your refrain. What is it that you're going to repeat throughout the poem? I'll take your love in rations. This portion will last till June, when my leaves turn brown and yours green, until June, when the wind howls in my hemisphere, an overt warning of the danger to come. Hold the ache in my chest till June, then tell someone. I'm ready to admit this won't last forever. Though I love you dearly, I will only breathe in gasps till June. I deserved to know there was another love brewing elsewhere. You are not cruel, only truthful. You may stay here until June. Then pack your heart into your new lover's breast, your ruin into her decaying chest. Only luck will spare you until June. So one of the identifying factors, or one of the criteria for writing a ghazal, is that you have to identify yourself in some way in the final line. And so my name, Nkateko, means luck in my home language, which is Tsonga. So then I used the word luck with a capital L as my identifying, as the part that identifies me. So let me move on. Oh, there's also a Sylvia Plath line here. So in her poem Mirror, Sylvia Plath says, I am not cruel, only truthful. And so in this one, I then took it to be the other person rather than myself. And I said, you are not cruel, only truthful. The next craft poem is Caesure for the Cessation of Blood. So during that time, when I was writing all of these craft poems, I learned about the caesura. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly. I know some people say Caesare, some say caesura, but I don't know. It's just that, what do you call it? That punctuation, the forward dash. So that's what you basically use it to divide parts of your poem in the way that you would use any other form of punctuation. And I was obsessed with the caesura at that time, and so I wrote this. You at the breakfast table, my heart on a platter. Words make good skewers. You, a horrid partner. Surgeon hands, killer eyes, I am yours to plunder. Offering basket for a body, cadaver your carnival. Cause of death unknown, add lies to the arsenal. Don't clap at my funeral. Please, sir, I did not mean to exit at the interval. And I think you can tell that I was in a very dark place because a lot of the poems talk about death, and sort of they idealize death in a way. I think because the breakup felt like maybe it would have been better to not be around. So it was a very, very dark time. But I'm glad that I had these poems to document what I went through. And that's what I love about poetry, that it shows me where I've come from and what I've overcome. And so this is still part of the craft poems. This is a contrapuntal. So a contrapuntal is a poem that can be read in 3 different ways. So the left column can be read on its own, vertically, and the right column can also be read on its own vertically. And then you can also read the poem horizontally, and it has 3 different meanings. So this poem was actually inspired by a date. I was living in the US at the time, and my then partner had an apartment in DC. So I was in DC at the time, and it had this gorgeous back porch where we used to go and have our meals. And on this particular night, we were trying to decide whether we're staying in or we're going out, and we couldn't quite agree. And so this poem is based on these different scenarios of what happened that night. So date night on the back porch or date night in absentia. I'm going to start with the left, then the right, and then I'll read it all together. In an alternate reality, a parallel universe, you ask me where I want to go for dinner, and I point to your chest and say, I want to stay right here. So plates appear, wine glasses too. You unlock the door, head to the back porch. A deleted scene from a movie about us, one where I dress up and you pick me up. Baby, there is nowhere else I would rather be, but you seem unappeased by my flattery. I stay indoors, you go out without me, have dinner with a friend, stumble back in at 4 a.m. In an alternate reality, a parallel universe, a deleted scene from a movie about us, you ask me where I want to go for dinner, one where I dress up and you pick me up. And I point to your chest and say, baby, there is nowhere else I would rather be. I want to stay right here. But you seem unappeased by my flattery. So plates appear, I stay indoors, wine glasses too. You go out without me. You unlock the door, have dinner with a friend, head back to the back porch, stumble back in at 4 a.m. So that is the end of the craft poems. And now we're moving into the last part, and these are the heartbreak, the boat or heartbreak poems. So the first one is Boat with No Oar. I circled your bed at midnight, chanting, love me, then made your silence my poison and died and still didn't have you in the brief, bitter afterlife that ensued. Imagine this wasn't a dream. Would you wake up and wade to sea with my soul? Would you remember me, broken boat, witch with no coven and no spell book, voyeur at your bedside glaring? Cast a shadow over your name and let me live there. Consummate our love posthumously. Throw a net over my apparition. I would do anything not to fall unheld. Swim back to the shore, alone, boat with no oar. Save a jilted ghost with waves for a dress, dead but still desperate for your affection. The waves change course, You wake up with my name seated at its throne, your tongue, which is to say, you are home now. I will no longer beg for what is mine. So this poem was basically inspired by reconciliation and the idea of thinking that something is over, but then realizing that that was not the case. So this one is catharsis. Under our bed, I find a graying photograph of the woman you loved and still love on mornings like this. Place it on the mantelpiece for you to inspect. Give you a chance to feign ignorance. At midday, we separate. It was inevitable, it seems. You having rolled out of the chrysalis of uncertainty, I having disengaged myself from a nightmare that was not mine. Now I know what the knife wielder held against her frame in my dreams each night was no common blade, but you, your body, always so close to her skin, always so red, yet it was always I who bled. This was inspired by dreams. I was having dreams about this particular relationship ending. And these dreams always included a third party who I did not know. And I wrote this to say that this stranger or this other person was always holding a knife in these dreams, or was holding a knife to our relationship in order to end it. And yet I was the one who was always bleeding. This next one is Boat at the Shore. In lieu of making you the boat and the oar, I have found another way to reach the shore. I am no longer stranded, like tendrils of hair desperate to be held together. I am not marooned, except when you wear that shirt. When you wear that shirt, then remove it. I want you and this love that hurts to hurt. I want your sweat on my skin, our sweet melancholy, our holy suffering. I lift my cup to drink, you pour. You know best how to part waters and still not take me home. So this was written in response to Boat with No Oar. So it turned out that what I thought was reconciliation was not. And so I wrote a response to that. And this is the unburdening. This one was written after a breakup, and I thought, what if I break into the place where we used to live together and just stroll through the washing line and see if you still wear the clothes that you used to wear when we were together. So I didn't actually do this, so please don't call the police on me. I walked through the washing line of our old apartment and saw remnants of you swaying in the breeze. Colorful ghostings, small hauntings reminding me you still breathe, still wear clothes that become stained enough to need washing. I wonder who undresses you now, how I used to, anxiously anticipating the joy and confusion of being loved by you, impatiently tugging at these now ghosts. Who unburdens themselves of desire and longing with their body pressed against yours now? Who unburdens themselves of desire and longing the way I now unburden these clothes from the confines of this washing line? I hold them close to my chest, hoping the security cameras do not get a clear view of me committing my third crime of the day, which is inhaling what soap could not wash away your scent, our scent. And this is called to consummate. I used to think it meant to consume one's mate, like the praying mantis or the black widow spider, the way it hurt at first. But we both survived and lived to repeat it, nightly some months. I cared a greater deal for the holding after and the longing before, our gentle beginning being the image I held as you unfolded folds of skin, kneading me, coaxing me to relax. I want to try it all again now that you have left, the way I first imagined it would be, safe and soft, like spring rain, rippling waves, and gentle rocking. So this is a poem about intimacy, and when you are in a situation where being intimate with someone is not as gentle as you imagined it to be. And so to consummate was about an experience where I wanted to, like I say, I want to try it all again now that you have left, but not the way that it happened, but rather the way that I imagined it would be. This one is called New Teeth. After the trip that had you spiraling from one manic episode to another, we pledged to get help together, left our bed in the city disheveled, and drove for what seemed like forever, until a screech, that sobering halt, pulled us apart, teeth from gums and truth from the story we'd concocted, from we're fine to 3 weeks in rehab, from we can stop anytime we like to this, your perfect mouth, a bare boulevard, an open road unmarked, well, almost. Your remaining teeth, white vans veered off a curb of gums like us that night, skidding to healing. You have new teeth, porcelain veneers, the hard enamel of a resilient mouth, you say proudly as you tell this story. Should I tell them that we lost more than teeth in the accident? I will say, I see this when I dream of that night. A child running towards me, laughing, mouth bare like his dad, pre-implants, arms wide, hair and eyes just like mine. So New Teeth is about trauma and trying to heal after a traumatic incident with a partner, and how we quantify our losses very differently. How one person might think that all they lost was a set of teeth in a particular incident, whereas for someone else, the loss is a lot deeper and a lot more difficult to recover from. And so the next, oh, that's it. That's all that I prepared for today. So yeah. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you so much for an absolutely wonderful reading. I'm going to ask everybody to unmute themselves and to please give Nkateko a very well-deserved round of applause.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful reading. Does anybody have any questions for Nkateko that they'd like to ask?
I saw some.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Jacques.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, thanks. And you?
It was a beautiful reading. Thank you. It was
Thank you.
very moving. I'm curious about the relationship between those molten, fiery poems and the craft, because something happens that's very interesting that I can't quite put into words, but that these emotions that are so vivid, you really take us there, and at the same time forms that are strict, even though you play with them. How does it feel to combine those two things? It's a fascinating, I mean, I can think of some other poets who do that, but it's very, very striking. And I wondered if you wanted to say something about that. So I'm very moved by that combination in a way I can't quite describe.
Thank you for that question, Jacques. So for me, craft is like a container in which I put the poem. And so I think of the poem itself as water or any other liquid. And I think of form as a type of container. So it could be a wine glass, it could be a jug, it could be a mug. And so I then experiment with how to put this water into these different containers and see what actually makes sense to me. So you'll find that I'll write something and it's not a pantoum the first time I write it. So the first draft is not a pantoum, but then I start to see how there are certain lines I want to repeat in certain ways. And then I then put it into the container of a particular form. And so I think that with experimenting with form, I don't lose the essence of the poem itself. I still want to say what I wanted to say from the beginning, just now putting it into a different container. And that does require that some lines fall away and so on. But that's how I do it. The structure of the poem is there before I choose a form to put it in, and to make sure that I still say what I want to say, but perhaps in a more interesting way. And that's what I wanted to do when I started learning about craft, is that I wanted to have more options. And you were saying that form is quite strict, and because you have to follow the rules, you can't have a ghazal and not follow the rules, or else it's not a ghazal. But in order to be able to break the rules in interesting ways, you need to know what they are. And
Yes.
that's what I wanted to do with my work, to really study these poetic forms and understand, what does a pantoum look like? What does a sestina look like? What does a ghazal look like? And how can I then play with this? And how can I take my work as it is and put it into these different kinds of containers? And it's been really fun. And so rather than being strict and rigid, it has expanded the ways in which I can share my work rather than limiting them.
And you're working on the emotions. There's something cathartic about that you cast it in a form, and then you've had to look at it and examine it.
Yeah, and repetition helps, especially if there's something that I want to echo. If there's a particular emotion that I feel, this is what I'm trying to emphasize. With forms that require repetition, I can then use those, and the repetition of the form itself allows me to then access that emotion, rather than in saying something once, it doesn't have the same effect as me repeating it, or if it keeps coming back in every stanza, because if it does that, then you just can't ignore it. It's there in every single stanza. And so I really enjoy poetic forms that require repetition, because I think there are certain things that I just want to say over and over again.
Thank you.
Thank you. I saw that there are questions in the chat, so maybe we can go through those.
Yes, I was just saying that, and then I realized I was on mute. So I was actually.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
so Nudi has a question in the chat about rhyme. What rhyme does rhyme do for you? Can you see the question?
I'm seeing Nudi's comment, beautiful pantoum, and that closing line. Did you have to seek permission to include the lines? Oh, so, okay, I'll go to Nudi's other question, but Nudi was asking about permission to include the lines. So with a cento, you don't have to ask for permission. So there's actually a writer who has a whole book made up completely of centos. His name is Chiswayo Mpanza. So Chiswayo wrote a book called The Reinhardt Frames, and this book won the Silliman Prize for African Poetry, and it's made up completely of centos. So you don't have to get permission to use lines. There is something called fair use in poetry, where you get guidelines on how much of someone's work you can use without having to ask for permission. What you do have to do is you have to acknowledge. So it's the same way when you are using someone's work in academic writing, you have to reference and you have to cite. So having at the end of the poem the names of the poems as well as the authors at the end of your poem is basically a citation. So you don't have to ask for permission. And Nudi's other question
Was about rhyme. What does rhyme do for you in relationship to your own poetry? How does it help you move the writing and editing of the poem?
Ooh, okay. So I always say that every word in a poem needs to audition for its place. And this is something that I learned from a friend of mine who's a playwright. So I took part in a writing residency a couple of years ago. And this friend, it was myself, a poet, then there was a novelist and a playwright. So the playwright, her name is Ife Dolapo, she's from Nigeria. So Ife said to me that if she puts something on the stage, then she's very intentional about it, because so basically every stanza has to be like a particular scene for her. So when she was reading my work, she would say, okay, stanza 1 is act 1, scene 1. What is on the stage? What is not on the stage? What is said? What is implied? And so Ife taught me that every word that I use in a poem, I need to be able to justify why that word. And so I do use rhyme. I like to play with sound. I think that it's really interesting when you hear how a poem sounds. I think that it's when you read something out loud, you tend to just find what's interesting. And so I do use rhyme if it aids the poem, if it helps the poem, if it helps me to bring my message across. But more than that, I think repetition. Repetition is what I lean on more than rhyme. But I do enjoy rhyme. I enjoy how poetry sounds because I love to read poetry. And so I think rhyme is like a foundational thing for me, from where I can then move the poem forward. I want to hear which words sound similar, which words make interesting sounds, but also preserve the meaning of the poem. How does it help you move through the writing and editing? So in the editing process, I think, like I said earlier on, with regards to the craft, I think that when I'm editing, I do look at every word and I say, is there a word that could work better than this? is there a word that could make a better sound and still keep the meaning of the poem? So I definitely do use rhyme. I employ rhyme. Sometimes the rhyming words don't make it in the final draft of the poem, but it's definitely a foundational tool for me when I'm writing. Because I think we all start off learning that poetry has to rhyme. And then as we learn more about it, because we start with limericks and all of those interesting kind of poems that we learn in school, and then we expand beyond that. So I think it's one of those tools that I learned early on that I still use as a foundation and then move beyond that. I want to.
Thanks. And then Emily has a poem has a question.
Uh-huh.
What drew you to writing poetry, and what's your path been like?
Ooh, my lived experience drew me to write. I think there isn't another way that I can express myself in the way that poetry allows me to. So I started writing back in primary school. I used to write, and I always had really good or very encouraging teachers who would actually put my poems up on the wall, and that really encouraged me. It made me feel like I can actually do this. And some of those poems weren't even particularly good, but I think it was the encouragement that really kept me going. And as I've started to learn more about poetry and started to explore craft a lot more, I think now I'm at a place where I can say I'm starting to understand poetry. So my path has been just expressing myself through the written word, and how I process things that happen to me is something will happen and I will work through it in the way that I'm working through it, by getting support or therapy or speaking to whoever I need to speak to. And then maybe months later, I'll sit down and actually be able to write a poem about it. So poetry allows me to reflect. It allows me to process my emotions. And so, yeah, I think what drew me to poetry is that I can use fewer words but say so much. And I just think that it's a genre that is, there's so much that you can do with it. Like I said at the beginning, I'm a confessional poet, and so there's so many different ways to do poetry. And so when I found that I am the kind of poet that someone referred to it as gossip about myself. So this friend said to me that I gossip about myself in my poetry, and basically that's what poetry allows me to do. It allows me to process my emotions. It allows me to gossip about myself, essentially.
Yes. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I think this brings us to the end of our the first half of the evening. It's really so refreshing to have a poet, especially a young poet, who cares so much about form. I think that's really great. I mean, I think there is no poetry without poetic form. So it's great that you've taken so much time to think about the importance of form. And as you say, you can't break the rules until you know the rules. So thank you so much for a really, really wonderful reading. I think before we move on to the break, I'd just like to ask everybody present just to give you another round of applause in thanks for your wonderful reading. Can you please unmute yourselves?
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really lovely reading. I'm going to end the recording now.